it worked. And then I'm just going to, okay, so I think we're good to go now. And apologies, I usually have a blazer on. I don't suspect I really need to apologize to you for that, but it is very hot in the New York City environs today, and we've been asked to not turn the air conditioning up high, and so it's a little warm here. I am going to continue, and with apologies also to people who were not here live last week and so didn't get the recording. Obviously, we had some technological issues, and so I wasn't able to record it. I will do my best to cover a little bit of the territory to make sure everybody's on the same page if there are people who weren't here last week, and then move into the new material in the last 40 minutes. But having said that, I also wanted to point out I should have done this at the beginning. We've been talking about social media and artificial intelligence for a couple weeks now, and this is part of the broader series of classes that I try to organize for an election year in which we think about the things that we should be talking about. If we were a well-functioning democracy, if we were less polarized, if we were better informed, if we were more sensitive to the most important challenges facing us as a society, but that because our political system is so fractured, so polarized, so captured by moneyed interests, we end up often missing out on. And so the specific issue for this little series is, of course, artificial intelligence and social media together and how they are restructuring the public sphere, political communication, the nature of the way in which we form the opinion that leads us to vote one way or another, to care about different political issues, or to evaluate a candidate in negative or a positive light. And I'm going to maybe pivot a little bit to slightly different vocabulary for a moment. And I think this is in part to help think through the way in which artificial intelligence may be changing the public sphere and political communication in the 21st century. And so I want to start by talking about a distinction I've come across recently in some of the research I'm doing between what you might call highly engaged or well-informed voters and less engaged and less well-informed voters, and not just in general, but in particular in terms of the way in which they gain access to the information they use to form their political opinions. And one way to express this is that highly engaged and informed voters find news, right? That they actively seek it, and very often that means they're reading newspapers, they're watching broadcast or cable TV, and that in the mind of a highly engaged voter, that may appear to be fairly continuous with what they were exposed to 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, because in a sense, those media systems have been less radically transformed by the coming onto line of digital media and social media technology. On the other hand, the less engaged, less informed voter, very often the news finds them as opposed to them finding the news, right? And it used to be, in a sense, that many of these people were relying on friends or relatives or colleagues who were more politically engaged. There was a kind of two-step function that political scientists like to talk about, in which, as long as there's somebody in your social network who does follow the news, you may not need to be particularly well informed or engaged. You get your news from them. And there are difficulties with that, right? The filter, the bias of the person who is providing you with your news may make it a little bit slanted. The lack of memory or expertise of this person may result in a confining of the information band to a narrower band than you would get if you were directly engaged. But at least you're getting, right, political information through not direct but indirect engagement. In the 21st century, that has really changed. And what has changed this is social media and the fact that social media, and then I'm going to add podcasts and reality TV and sports networks, but also sports online sites that allow you to talk about the team you like most with people who like them, have become conduits for political information to varying degrees. And so one of the things we've looked at a little bit, I'll say a little bit more about maybe a little later on, is Joe Rogan, who's right, a personality who talks about ultimate fighting or mixed martial arts, and not really directly personal, but I'm sorry, not really directly political, but nevertheless, it's pretty clear if you spend a little bit of time watching him that he really doesn't like Joe Biden and mainstream politics, that he's an anti-institutionalist, if you will, and that he's much more friendly to the populism of Donald Trump, and that people who are into mixed martial arts may now be being influenced by Joe Rogan. And by the way, there's a pretty good indication that people who watch Joe Rogan, listen to Joe Rogan, are leaning heavily towards Trump. And similarly with social media in general, right? And to be as clear as possible about this, and I know not all of us are highly engaged with social media, but social media are many to many media platforms. Anyone can put anything out there, and they use artificial intelligence and algorithms to determine, of the near infinite universe of possible information available on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or WhatsApp, what are you going to see? Right. And so on the one hand, there are people that you are connected with on many of these platforms. Their content is going to come to you. But on the other hand, your media consumption habits on the platform have been surveilled, right? That they are watching what you pay attention to. And most of these platforms will embed cookies in your technology device, which is a form of surveillance. So they may not only be watching you on their platform, but also overall what you're doing on your digital device. And then they have profiled you and generated a pretty precise behavioral model of what someone like you wants to see on social media. And they're feeding from that vast universe of potential content precisely targeted stuff to keep you engaged with their platform. And so now, to come back to people who have low engagement with politics and the news finds them, the news finds them via social media. And the result is, on the one hand, that the conduit for communication has transformed. You're no longer hearing it from your neighbor or your friend or your relative or your colleague. Now you're hearing it down a mass disseminated broadcast channel or technology. And on the other hand, the opportunity for it to appear more professional, more objective, more polished, more impartial, to look a lot like a broadcast television news segment or a newspaper article, has gone up dramatically because, of course, the people producing the content that is finding you probably aren't professional journalists, right? Unless you're a peculiar sort of person who likes professional journalism a lot. But it may behoove them to appear to have some of the hallmarks of professional journalism. And all that to say, right, that there are new ways that news is finding people who are not finding news. And so the idea that if you are less engaged with politics, the way in which political communication is structured, the way in which your information channels are being reconfigured has transformed dramatically in the 21st century, more so than it has for people who actively find the news themselves, unless those people have decided, I want to move over to Instagram or Twitter to get my news. And there are some people who are news junkies, highly engaged, who have supplemented their mainstream news diet or displaced their mainstream news diet with these alternative sources. I've given you some evidence that this is altering our process of forming public opinion, which is, of course, highly influential on how we vote and how our society is governed. We've looked at the idea that Republicans cheer louder and boo harder, the idea that their partisan consumer sentiments are more strongly influenced by whether their party is or is not in charge of the presidency than is the case with Democrats. Not that the Democrats don't also have a partisan inflection of their economic perceptions, but the Republicans have more amplification of their partisan sentiments. And I've suggested, moving beyond these findings and what the research actually supports, that a likely explanation for this is that this is occurring because of the media system that Republicans are occupying and how it differs from the media system that Democrats are occupying. There's a much greater likelihood, if you're a Republican, that you're watching only one cable news network, Fox News, and the rhetoric, the ambiance, the affect of Fox News is very much imported from AM radio, right? And so this idea that you exaggerate the degree to which you detect a political threat when the opposing party is in power. Barack Obama is in power, and as a result, we now have a socialist president, and the economy is going to go to hell in a handbasket because he's going to destroy the medical system with Obamacare. He's going to regulate the economy to the point where he chokes off all entrepreneurial activity. He's going to tax the wealth creators to the point where they flee and go and invest elsewhere, right? And that is said again and again and again in a highly alarmist and amplified way. And the result is that you, if this is your primary source of news, come to be convinced that the economy while Obama is in power is really bad. And I don't want to say that MSNBC or CNN aren't trumpeting some of Obama's accomplishments while Obama is in power, and hence the exaggeration of economic sentiment on the part of Democrats. But it's not being done in the same way and to the same degree. And by the way, people who are not on the Fox News diet, who haven't been told by Fox News that we are the only fair and balanced station, that everything else is fake news, they do tend to change the channel. They do tend to get multiple sources. And CNN, sometimes MSNBC, more likely to have a diversity of opinion in their network, in the views that are represented. So all of that to say, it seems to me that although we can't establish causation, there's a pretty strong correlation between what's going on in the media world and what's going on in partisan perceptions of the social world and the way in which the media system is shaping how we perceive reality in general, these partisan divides, and then in particular on the right, the amplification of panic and disgust at the policy and politics of the other side. I've shown you, right, that the media that is your primary source of information, right? The media system, whether it's newspapers or social media or YouTube or cable news, strongly correlates with your likelihood of one supporting one candidate or another in the 2024 campaign. That Breitbart, in particular, right, an online media source run by Steve Bannon, funded by the Mercers, strongly seeded the immigration issue in the 2016 election cycle, going back to 2015. And I'll just say a little bit more about this, right? Steve Bannon and Breitbart were very sophisticated in the way in which they followed the influence of their stories. How many, because it's an online media platform you can track directly, how many of the immigration stories were getting clicked on, were getting read, were getting shared, were getting linked by other sites? How likely was that story to go viral as opposed to other ways of looking at the news? What's going on in Afghanistan, what's going on with the economy in general, what's going on with crime or drug addiction and overdoses, right? Some of the other stories that could have been focal for the 2016 election campaign. And what Breitbart and Bannon discovered, and remember that Steve Bannon went back and forth between being a senior advisor to Donald Trump and running his own little and increasingly influential media empire, and the discovery that immigration had this capacity to capture the attention of people who might not be terribly engaged with politics or might otherwise be inclined to support a Hillary Clinton, and to shift them either into activated voters or into voting for a candidate who really spoke to their perceptions of an immigration crisis. Remember, by the way, that in 2016, we still have a very low level of undocumented people crossing the border and getting into the United States. This is a hangover from the 2008-2010 recession, and has to do with the fact that economies elsewhere are doing better than our economy, right? And so there's less of a pull and a push for immigration. But when you start talking about it, people's ears open, their eyes light up, they become more engaged. And the result is that this is emphasized by Trump and eventually picked up by Fox. This is a new model of identifying and promulgating a salient issue in a political campaign. So we fast forward to 2024. Again, I spoke a little bit about this last week. I will just briefly point out, right? And there's a new image here, right? And it's an image that is circulating a lot online. Frankly, it came into my Facebook feed. I was a little surprised to see it, right? And it's a doctored image. It's an image of Joe Biden having fallen down at a military graduation ceremony. This really did happen, but what's been photoshopped into this is that he was wearing diapers, and that when he fell down, the diapers were exposed. This is being referred to as a cheap fake as opposed to a deep fake. It's not a very sophisticated effort to alter the image. It's got some signs that it's been fairly obviously photoshopped, that the diaper doesn't really seem to be on Joe Biden so much as interposed into the image. But having said all of that, right, it's one of many images. And you may have seen the New York Times recently looked at videos that have been doctored just by changing the angle, changing the frame to make it appear that Joe Biden is just wandering off in the middle of the D-Day commemoration, when in fact he's going to talk to some paratroopers, or that he's trying to sit down in a non-existent seat when in fact the chair is there. It just doesn't show up from that camera angle that there is this effort to disseminate images that make Biden appear to be decrepit, incompetent, and increasingly demented, and incapable, disqualified for performing the offices of the presidency, and that this kind of image would not have had the degree of exposure and influence, the lack of context, the viral potential in the old media system that it has today. That Joe Biden is, so far as I can tell, not really trying to hit back. By the way, some of these cheap fakes and these doctored videos are being circulated by the Trump campaign, and Joe Biden's campaign, I could be corrected about this, but as far as I can tell, is not doing the same, in part because it appears that the likely Biden supporter is less likely to be influenced by this stuff than is the person that the Trump campaign is trying to reach. But Joe Biden is clearly trying to get younger social media influencers to disseminate positive news and information about them. Biden recognizes he is not at home in this media environment. He's not someone who came of age or easily adapted to this new media environment. And so he's hoping that some people who are more adroit in using social media, more influential within social media, will pick up his content and support him. But it's turning out to be difficult for Joe Biden. He really is a man of the 20th century and not the 21st century, a politician made for an era of broadcast, not of narrowcast digital and social media. I also pointed out very quickly, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but I just think, right, the scholar Philip Howard, the head of the Internet and Democracy Institute at Oxford University. Oxford, by the way, is concentrating right now a lot of technology research, I think, in really interesting ways. He titles his most recent book on how social media is influencing democracy, lie machines. And here, right, I mean, obviously he's trying to capture our attention, trying to alarm us, but I do think it captures very nicely the problem with social media, which is that it is truth indifferent, that it is many to many, anybody can put anything on it, that it privatizes publicly relevant communication. I see something on my news feed on Instagram or X or Facebook, and unless I'm very careful to record it or somebody else is, and by the way, that's not always easy, um, it's just my communication, right? And maybe everybody that it went to has no interest in disseminating it more broadly or calling it to the attention of people who might scrutinize it and try to figure out if it's fake or tendentious or a piece of disinformation. And so this capacity to find private conduits for publicly relevant communications, to disseminate things without filter or gatekeeper, to basically push information out on the basis of people's reaction to it. Do they share it with other people? Do they put a like symbol on it? Do they react with an emoji? Those, right, are the coin of the realm of social media, not the verifiability, the truth content, the plausibility, the significance of the story. There is no journalist making those editorial decisions. There is an algorithm, right? A complex AI supported computer program designed to monitor how engaged we are with different kinds of content that promotes the content that engages us most. It's a very different media system. Again, reviewing quickly that the most recent Stanford AI report reports on the capacity of AI to very quickly generate fake news that appears to be real news, deep fakes, to figure out which of the various ways of formatting and conveying this content can make its way past the filter or gatekeeping artificial intelligence built into these platforms to figure out which are most likely to be shared or to engage readers, to continuously alter the content as new information comes in, to micro target the content to different users based on precise profiles of the kind of content that might work on them. The Anthropic study that shows one of the best ways that AI can convince someone to change their political mind or their mind about a political issue is by using deceptive information in their political communication. So AI can design political communication, it can use deception. It doesn't have any of the conscience or qualms that human beings have evolved to have about deceiving each other. And it turns out it's very effective and fast at doing this. It does deeply concern me that we're in the middle of a presidential election in which this is already happening and that we won't figure out till 2025, 2026 how much this influenced our political behavior, our vote, our opinion in 2024. So I've pointed out to you again last week, and not the first time. I like my Mickey Mouse Fantasia graphic, right? That we tend to go in the 21st century where our technology takes us. We don't spend a lot of time or effort. We don't really have the regulatory capacity or the will to ask in advance, is it good that we allow this new technology to be developed and then disseminated commercially? We do it and then we figure out after the fact whether it's good or bad. You may have seen in the last week the Surgeon General of the United States has announced that he is recommending that we have warning labels on social media devices, especially for children, that he thinks the danger here is akin to tobacco or alcohol, the addictive potential, the potential to change mood, affect, and potentially lead to depression and self harm is such that we should be regulating it. I'll just point out very quickly that this is quite belated, right? We've been using this technology more and more and at younger ages for, and then, maybe 15 years now, and only after the fact do we recognize the dangers associated with it. We are in the same world with artificial intelligence, right? That the sign that we don't regulate technology is how quickly and ubiquitously we adapt new technology, right? It used to maybe take 50 or 100 years for new technology to go from being something that was novel to something that was just integrated into our daily lives. Now we do it in 10 years or less. The result is that we have less time to anticipate the dangers, less time to build up the cultural and normative resources with which to cope with the bad effects of the technology. This is a rapidly accelerated technological world. When it comes to AI in particular, it is privately owned, being developed by industries that are, of course, beholden to their shareholders for profits, that are therefore engaged in an arms race with each other. And though, and I think it's worthwhile just noting very quickly, the vast majority of the people working in the most important levels of management and development in this field say, regulate us, right? That's very unusual for an industry's leaders to be coming to Washington and saying, we're worried about the dangers associated with our technology. Please, maybe even put us on sabbatical, have a hiatus in the development of this technology so that we can figure out a little bit better what it's doing and how to regulate it. Although they're saying that, they're not self restraining, right? Because they're in an international race to develop this technology, and to the winners go the spoils, and to the losers, they very well may collapse. And so absent governmental regulation, the race is on. The race is progressing very quickly, right? We see a doubling every 2 years of the amount of computing power used to train AI systems, from roughly 1960 to 2012, when there's this big breakthrough with what's called AlexNet. And then beginning in 2012 to the present, the right doubling of computing power being turned over to AI is occurring every 3.4 months. And so we're seeing a incredibly accelerated, lightning fast expansion of the computing power of AI, of what AI can do, right? This is in the background, the accelerated power of computing as such, the amount of data that AI has to be trained on, and the consequent rate of breakthroughs coming now practically every year. This then takes us to the world we're in, which is a world where AI can do things that, frankly, were limited to the imagination of sci fi writers as recently as 10, 12 years ago, right? The big breakthrough here has to do with dispersed deep neural network computing, multiple layers of artificial neural networks created within computers. Note, please, that the AI now learns for itself. We don't program it. We humans, at best, we tune it and help it to identify the mistakes it's making, but it learns language for itself. It learns chess for itself. And one of the signs that it is really learning new things, that it has generative capacities, as we say, is that it solves problems we can't solve. It's better at us at games of strategy, but also it has solved the protein folding problem that, if a human being had solved, would almost certainly have garnered the Nobel Prize in chemistry, right? And so, right, we've got large language models now, and that's where I really want to focus. That is to say, AI that is able, through mapping the terrain of a natural language, right? Literally translating words into numbers, seeing how they're associated with each other, seeing how they're grammatically structured to produce language that, first of all, human beings can't distinguish from language produced by humans, right? And so there's an uncanny naturalness of the language that the machines are producing. And second of all, that turns out to be as or potentially more persuasive than what human beings say. And this is where I'm going to focus in terms of the political threat of AI, Please note all kinds of scientific, military, commercial, medical applications to this technology. And I want to be as clear as possible. Solving the protein folding problem is a major breakthrough. And it may be that AI is going to be incredibly valuable in doing some of the basic science research necessary to develop new medicines that will alleviate some of the most destructive and painful diseases that plague humanity. It may be incredibly important in helping us to identify ways to solve or manage for climate change, right? And we could keep going. It may be really important in helping us to figure out how to regulate artificial intelligence or restructure political communication. But having said all of that, that will take um, real willingness to regulate, to think critically, to control this technology. And that is something that at present appears to be generally lacking in our politics. I won't review this again, but please remember we talked in some detail about how these artificial neural networks are structured and restructured so that the machine can perform the task that it's asked to perform, for instance, sorting cats from dogs. And if it's given enough computational power and enough data, it can do this very effectively. Same thing with language. So, having said all of that, next big topic, right? What's the business model that is driving social media? Social media that is now increasingly using artificial intelligence, not only in the background in its algorithm, but in the foreground to generate its content. Mm. Here I've drawn on the influential, important work of Shoshana Zuboff in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And we've looked at this already. Remember that, right, when Google went public, it was this incredibly powerful system for navigating the web, searching for the right website, and yet it was being used all over the world, but not really generating very much profit. And that what Google discovered as a profitable asset was so-called surplus data, right? Its users were not just using the search engine. If you surveilled them, if you followed their online behavior, you could actually learn a lot about them. And so this solves Google's profitability problem. It leads to this model of surveillance capitalism in which profit is accumulated from the extraction of information about human behavior. And that turns out to be incredibly valuable to create an entirely new channel for generating profit. And note one of the things that happened last week is NVIDIA became the most highly valued corporation in the world, right? It's making the chips that drive this technology. Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic, all of the companies engaged in this, I should have said Meta and Microsoft, right, are in one way or another profiting from their capacity to predict and control human behavior. This is something that is not entirely new. Obviously, advertising, commercial advertising, has been around for at least a couple centuries. But having said that, this is an entirely different, unprecedented mechanism for shaping human behavior. And so, sorry, I left out a T. The result has been this what Zuboff calls extraction imperative and dispossession cycle. And by that, she means that there is an imperative to get more and more and more information about our behavior and to make sure that less and less of that behavior can be uh, controlled by us, put behind some kind of barrier of privacy to prevent it from being extracted. The consequence of all of this, right? And so the data is left there by us because we consent, right? By checking a box with vast contractual backdrop to it that most of us can't and certainly don't bother to read. We check the user agreement, and now, right, the program, the platform that we're using embeds in our device cookies that allow it to surveil us. We are therefore, all of our online behavior and data is being swept up and then analyzed, generating prediction products. These prediction products are being sold on an auction market, being monitored to make sure that they actually accurately predict what we do. And this is one of the central ways in which 21st century capitalism generates profit from our economic activities. It just occurred to me. Give me just one moment. I'll be right back, I promise. So sorry. My watch is being tuned. My phone was charging in the other room. I had no idea what time it was, so I had to go run and get my phone. So with all of this in the background, um, I hope then that again, right? We spoke about this last week, but the idea that among the ways that this new business model operates is to capture the attention, to hold the attention, to deliberately engineer these devices, these platforms to be as addictive as possible, right? And please note, it's not just technologists who work for these companies. A lot of psychologists, a lot of behavioral scientists who have studied addiction go to work for these companies in order to design their devices to be maximally addictive. Some of them have right fits of conscience and end up describing the work that they've done and criticizing the corporations that they work for. But this is very highly paid work. And there's the classic excuse, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will do it. So there is this growing literature about what one person, right, D. Graham Burnett calls the fracking of our attention, the ongoing effort to forcibly extract attention that we no longer voluntarily provide to these media. And if you've ever had the experience, there's a colloquial phrase for this of going down the rabbit hole, right? Of going onto a device to do one thing. And then 20 minutes, half an hour later, you realize that the device sucked you in and you've been doing 20 other things, none of which are related to the original thing that you went online to do. You recognize the experience of the device capturing and redirecting your attention to where it wants it to go so that it can monitor your behavior, capture your data, and generally keep you where it wants you to be in order to best be able to predict on the basis of the information it's collecting things that are valuable to the people who want to buy their behavioral prediction models. The result of all of this is a sharp decline in the attention span of media users. Gloria Marx suggests it's down to around 47 seconds. A sharp increase in fractured attention, right? An incapacity to pay attention to one thing for very long. As a teacher who likes to go deep with texts and to give long technical or detailed lectures, as you may have noticed, this can be very frustrating. Right? When I'm dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds, I am often forced to try to meet them halfway. My friends at NYU tell me that they are told that 10 minutes is the maximum amount of time they can concentrate on any one topic, that they have to change topics every 10 minutes. I think I said this last week, but imagine trying to teach Moby Dick where you can only pay attention for 10 minutes at a time, right? That's the fracturing of attention. There are deep ethical and existential questions raised by this. If we are, as William James suggested, what we pay attention to, if, on the other hand, there's this century-long research enterprise of controlling our attention for commercial purposes. Tim Wu's Attention Merchants, I think, is very good on this as well. If there's a decline in the spaces that cultivate our attention, then really we may be becoming less autonomous, less capable of controlling the fundamental cognitive and psychological capacity that allows us to control ourselves, to take control over the kind of people we are. All right, so finally now moving into the newer material. And I'm going to focus now specifically on the public sphere, on political communication, on the information system that provides us with the knowledge or ideas that influence what we think about politics. And I'm going to draw on the work of the very influential, knowledgeable, interesting Princeton, and then I'm going to call her a sociologist and a technologist. I think she's a little bit hard to categorize. Zeynep Tufekci, and you may have seen she writes a fair bit in the New York Times, especially about COVID and things to do with public health. She's been paying more attention to bird flu as the new bird flu seems to be growing as a threat. But she wrote this book a little bit less than a decade ago called Twitter and Tear Gas, the Power and Fragility of Networked Protest, that although its primary focus is on networked uh, social movements and how social movements that engage in protests like the Arab uprisings of a decade ago, or the Occupy Wall Street movement, or the Black Lives Matter movement, or the Zapatista movement, how they're using this new technology and how this new technology is maybe shaping the culture of protest movements. Fascinating topic, but in the process of addressing her main topic, she has a lot to say about how new media changed the public sphere in general. Some of her earlier writing was on that topic as well. And so the idea that we now have a networked digital public sphere, that this is a public sphere that is fundamentally distinct from the public sphere of print journalism, which of course was the public sphere in which the American and French revolutions occurred, in which democratic reforms slowly took hold in Europe, in which democratic constitutions emerged in the 19th century. That public sphere is gone, as is the public sphere of broadcast media, of radio and television, of mass distributed newspapers. We are now in a public sphere where the fundamental structuring technology is digital technology that includes the internet, that includes smartphones and Wi-Fi and the capacity to be ubiquitously connected to a constantly transforming network of connection and communication. And then, of course, social media as one of the main platforms or media outlets through which people access this much more extensive network of communication. And so her claim, and I think it's exactly right, is that publics are being reconfigured through the assimilation of this new digital technology, that there's a vast opening of networks, that it used to be that if you wanted to get something out to a mass audience, you had to convince the New York Times to publish it or ABC News to cover it. And now you can just post it wherever you want to on Facebook or Instagram or X or YouTube. And if you know what you're doing, you can probably tailor your content so that it can go viral and so that it will reach a lot of people. We're in a many to many network of communication as opposed to a one to many. The term that's used, I'm sorry, it's a neologism, but affordances, right? New technologies afford new opportunities to do things that were simply technically impossible to do under the old technology. Under the old technology of broadcast and print media, if I wanted to reach a whole bunch of people, well, either I had to work for one of these media outlets or I had to convince them to cover me, and neither one of those things was particularly easy for an average person to do. Under this new digital communication technology, there are new affordances, new things that can be done, and this is altering the very nature of the way in which the public forms its opinion, expresses its ideas. So, among the things that Tefekci documents is that we now have many more weak ties. I'll give a simple example. I'm on Facebook and I have a beloved old teacher, my debate coach from high school, who I have seen maybe twice in the last 20 years, right? And in the world of yesterday, that would mean we really didn't have any social connection, right? It would be occasionally rekindling the old connection if we happen to come together, and then falling out of contact for another decade or 20 years, right? In the new world, we're Facebook friends, right? And he's very active on Facebook. And so I get his information on a regular basis, whether it's about the Berkeley Bears or the Oregon Ducks or what Trump is doing, etc. Right? And so the expansion of weak ties of people whom we might have been connected with at some point in our life, but who in a prior world we would have fallen out of contact with, and the creation of new cross-cutting networks, right? So the fact that I'm connected to my debate coach means all of a sudden Facebook recommends that I also connect with all of these other people connected with my debate coach. And some of them were acquaintances when I was in high school. We were on the same forensics team. Okay, I'll connect with them too. And they are connected to other people, and some of them seem interesting. And so I connect to them too. And all of a sudden, Black Lives Matter, the Arab uprising, are possible because a single activist or a small group of them can use their weak tie but cross-cutting and diffuse network to get the word out. Come to Tahrir Square. Look at what has just happened and what we need to do about George Floyd's murder, etc. Right? And then the second big affordance, the idea that there is no longer a professional journalist, an editor, a producer, someone who works for a corporation telling you, well, you can't say that because it's not true or it's not verified or we can't confirm it, or because the corporation that we work for doesn't want you saying that it's disadvantageous to it. So the falling away of gatekeepers is a double-edged sword. It has led to the dissemination of large amounts of unvetted information, some of which may be publicly relevant, like the extent to which African Americans are subject to police violence, which mainstream media was not covering very well, or the knowledge that not just me, but almost everyone in my society doesn't like this dictator. Up until recently, there was no way for me to establish that. Now that I know it, I am going to come to Tahrir Square and join a million other people and overthrow the old regime. But at the same time, it also means that really bad information, that vaccines are bad for you or unhelpful in controlling a pandemic, that this is all a conspiracy to implant technology in us that will then allow governments and the United Nations to monitor us. We could keep going, right? But there's a ambivalence to this. New things can be shared across broader networks that may lead to new political possibilities, but it's also the case that an awful lot of junk and BS ends up flooding the public sphere. Final issue that Tefekci calls our attention to as a central affordance of this new technology, which is that the economy of knowledge and information, which used to be one of scarcity, right? It was really hard to be heard. It was the case that the number of voices who achieved some prominence in the public sphere was limited to a handful or a small number of people. And that in the 21st century, in a sense, we have the opposite problem. You might call it an embarrassment of riches, but psychologists also speak of cognitive overload. There's just too many different competing ideas and perspectives and claims out there for us to know how to evaluate it all. There's a superabundance of knowledge and information in the new public sphere, right? And so I do have my phone. I do now recognize that I've used up the time for today. Let me hit pause and we can continue this conversation next week, but I do want there to be time for your thoughts, questions, comments. Who wants to start us out for today? This making sense? I went a little faster today because a fair bit of it was review, but I also thought that would be helpful because this is, I think, for many of us, a new world. Flossie, I can see you got your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself so we can hear you, please. Flossie, you're still muted. There you go. Good. Thank you.
So in the 40s, there was a song, very popular, and it ran.
Oh, you're muted, Flossie. You got to hold that. Go ahead. No, hold it down. There you go.
Where we come from, they ain't had too much learning. Still, they're happy as can be, doing what comes naturally. And I have noticed that wherever there is an opportunity for the entertaining crowd to put in their 2 cents, it comes out in a little skit, comes out in a little song. It isn't too harmful, but it's subtle and it hits the younger crowd because it's quick. You can sing it, you can ring it, you can bring it. So that's subtle enough.
Yeah,
What worries me is what is happening to Dr. Fauci. That is very subtle and very mean. So I worry about that. Okay.
yeah, and thank you for that, Flossie. And I do think, I mean, when we look at, and I'm going to call it the kind of anti-institutional um, ambiance of the new media system, right? So there's an article where somebody called to my attention the other day. Only sheep follow media journalists, right? You know, this idea that you should get your opinion from Joe Rogan or Taylor Swift, or and then pick your influencer, right? Because they have information that the mainstream media doesn't have, but also because they are anti-institutional, because these elites are not interested in you, are not like you, are not on your side. They've just enriched themselves, and now they're trying to convince you that they're more knowledgeable than you, and you should just fall in line with them. This is, I think, a really important aspect of the zeitgeist of the culture of this new media technology, and it is part of the reason that Joe Biden struggles so mightily, that the Democrats are seemingly at such a disadvantage in this election, is they are institutionalists. He especially is an institutionalist. So we're back to the theme that he doesn't fit the mood of the moment. But now the explanation is not only economic, it's also to do with the media infrastructure of the public sphere of the 2020s. Thank you, Flossie. I don't know the song. I'm going to try to find it when we're done. Dorothy, go ahead.
Do you have any thoughts about the effectiveness of the Lincoln Project videos?
Yeah, I'm not following the Lincoln Project videos in detail yet, but I was thinking when Flossie was talking, and so some of the Lincoln Project videos do use humor, right? Do I have that correct? They're not just, trying to criticize Trump. They're making fun of Trump. And I was thinking while Flossie was talking, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Randy Rainbow. I haven't seen him for a while, but he's an online influencer, and he takes old musical numbers and turns them into, I think, quite funny, clever anti-Trump messages. And as opposed to criticizing Trump, he's ridiculing Trump, right? And I do think we're in a historical moment that lends itself to satire, right? And maybe the Lincoln Project, the Randy Rainbow, the Joe Rogan approach in the 21st century both is one that has a more conducive media environment behind it and a better fit with the culture of younger voters, younger people, in part because of the way in which that culture is being influenced by this media structure. Yeah, so Dorothy, I'll take a look out. Is there a commercial in particular
No,
that?
not in particular.
Okay.
Some of them are funny, but I actually find some of them almost too loud and obvious.
Yeah.
And I'm a little concerned that they're going to actually turn some people off. So
Yeah.
it's a mixed bag. of what they do.
Interesting. Well, I will take a look. I believe that's David who's got his camera off, but his hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I will turn it on. Hang on a second.
Doesn't matter too much to me. You're more interested in hearing what you have to say,
Oh,
although I
well,
like the Golden
that's
Gate
true.
Bridge.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't think I score very high on either the visual or the auditory image score, but we'll do our best. I was just thinking, though, of uh, what the media metaphor would be for liberal progressives, and I think it's probably Saturday Night Live is what we're talking about. But I think the media metaphor for conservative MAGAs is Fox News. And I think that that's a very different kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe I haven't looked at the right places, but I haven't seen a lot of satire about Joe Biden. I think the attacks are literal and dead serious and misleading, but they're not humor. I don't see any intention of humor. They seem to me to be dead serious, and that may be an interesting distinction in terms of the sort of the aura in which the message is conveyed.
Yeah, and I said a little bit about this at the outset. I do think that if we look at the history of media technology, and so part of this has to do with, right, the sense when the Democrats in the mid 1960s started passing civil rights legislation, and Southern whites, especially men, began to feel abandoned by the Democratic Party and began looking elsewhere for people who would confirm their identity, right? The Republican Party started to move in that direction, the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon. But fast forward now to the late 1970s when FM radio comes online and all of the music moves off the AM dial, and now the AM dial is kind of open, cheap territory, and Rush Limbaugh and the AM radio talk jockeys come in, and at the more or less same time, the federal government deregulates, right? Removes the requirement of balance, allows for syndicalization. And now, right, you've got people on AM radio who would not have had a place on mainstream media. And coming back to your comment here, David, very often they're very serious, right? But they're also much more bombastic and panicked and
Right.
combative and extreme in what they say, so the content, but especially in the rhetoric, right? And that old comment from Karl Rove, right, from early 2000s, we are not part of the reality-based community. Speaking of the Republican Party or the core constituency of the Republican Party, I think he's talking about the fact that our opinions are being formed in this alternative media universe that is not the media that you liberals are watching. And maybe you liberals are more disciplined by the need to confirm via credible sources and plausible verification what it is you're reporting. But we have an alternative model of producing our news, information, knowledge, opinion, and it's working, right? And so yes, it can be serious, it can be funny, it can be mean, it can be bombastic, it can be extreme, it can be panicked. I do think that there's a range of different possibilities here. I do think the medium in part shapes the message. It migrates from AM radio into Fox. It migrates from Fox onto social media. It migrates then to podcasts and other ways of disseminating social media content online, right? But it has, I think, also a kind of core I'm saying ambiance, culture, content, style to it that is very much like the populism of the contemporary politics, not just of the United States, but you see what happened in the European elections. We see what's happening in so many other places in the world, right? And so yes, I don't think it all has to be light or funny or apolitical. A fair bit of it is dark and nasty and vehement and bombastic as well. Thank you for pointing that out, David.
Mhm.
Anybody else with a thought or a comment for today?
Mhm.
Well,
Glad.
just one other thing.
Go ahead.
One other real quick thing is we cannot deny the immediacy of the viral possibilities of the internet too. I mean, 50 years ago, to have uh, 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 100,000 people pay attention to a soundbite would have taken weeks. Now it takes 30 seconds,
And
and the like, and that just is a real game changer too. But and I think that that has to do also with the fact that there's very little deliberateness in checking for the trustworthiness of things, and they get out there and they go viral even before they've had a chance to be confirmed. I was thinking of Bernstein and Woodward and how
mhm.
they couldn't publish the story about Nixon until they'd gotten three confirmations. That's all gone, as far as I can tell. Maybe it's still in some of the liberal press, but it's certainly not in the conservative press. That standard has long since flown the coop.
Yeah, I mean, and to be as clear as possible, we know from the Dominion lawsuit and from the discovery that not only does Fox not confirm, it willingly broadcasts and amplifies information that it knows to be false and that it views as, on the one hand, kooky and on the other hand, dangerous because that's what gets it viewership, right? And so I'm fond of that Mark Twain quip that a lie goes halfway around the world before the truth has time to get up and put its pants on. But recognize, right, that the reason the lies are viral is because they speak to something we want to believe. They articulate a feeling structure that has some plausibility to us. They tell us that our identities are a-okay and all that stuff about us being culpable for racism or for climate change. That's nonsense. And yes, the new media structure allows that stuff to circulate, and it circulates on, right, digital cable news networks. It circulates on dedicated news services like Breitbart, but then it really takes hold in the realm of social media. And please note that part of the change that's happened here is that the stuff that's circulating on social media, to come at it from the opposite order, right? That starts in social media. Somebody just says something that they think is going to go viral, and boom, it takes off. It then gets amplified by the broadcast media networks. It's asymmetrical, right? It's part of the problem that the mainstream media and the liberals and the Democrats are having, right? Is their media system is not as willing to broadcast the false stuff because they still adhere to the old journalistic ethics. But having said that, a substantial portion of our media ecosystem is willing to broadcast it as long as it will bring the viewers and hence the revenues in. John, go ahead. Your name tag says Ruth, but I know that's not Ruth. Go ahead.
Not Ruth, it's me. I did just a small note that I wouldn't say the whole conservative press. I mean, the Wall Street Journal is the conservative press, and I would say the Wall Street Journal's news coverage or the Wall Street in general is not as biased as the New York Times.
I'm not sure I agree with the last bit, but I completely agree that the Wall Street Journal is a highly credible, professional, ethical news organization, and I rely on them and I learn from them. So yes, and by the way, we can look at the spectrum, and so I don't really consider to the Wall Street Journal to be particularly conservative. It's not nearly as far out as say Fox is, and there's some research done on how to measure where news coverage is on an ideological spectrum based on what they say, and uh, I think that the Wall Street Journal is center right based on the research I'm looking at. John, you want to come back on that?
Well, that may be if I see the definition you're using of conservatism is basically the far right. I mean, in any real sense of the word meaning of conservatism, the Wall Street Journal is way more conservative than. But anyway, yes, center right. That's true enough. Yeah.
And by the way, you might say that Fox and Breitbart aren't really right at all anymore, right wing in a traditional perspective, right? They become nativist, populist, um, and in ways that seem in many ways to be in tension with the conservatism of Burke or Reagan, however we want to identify our classical conservatism. So point taken. Yeah, go ahead.
I will say when I was in graduate school studying political science that my professor in Japanese politics, James Morley, said one time, I remember very well, that, the right wing, he was talking about Japan, but, the right wing and the left wing often converge. And in fact, there was just a bit in the papers someplace or other lately saying how anti-Semitism is now the equal property of the far right and the far left. The far right has always been, and now the left in America has become, I wouldn't personally call it anti-Semitism, but it's widely seen as such. I mean, the fact that it's the far left people, about 40% are Jewish, undercuts that a little bit. But
yeah, I mean, and right, the topic for an entirely different day. Can you be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitist, if that's a meaningful distinction? Can you be strongly critical of Netanyahu and the way in which the current government of Israel is conducting the war in the Gaza Strip without being anti-Zionist, right? As we begin to multiply those distinctions, we perhaps begin to be able to make better sense of strongly critical movement against the Israeli campaign in Gaza that has an awful lot of sympathy from an awful lot of Jews, right? But yes, left and right do sometimes bend at the extremes closer to each other. And, there's a populism of the left as well as a populism of the right. And sometimes both can be anti-immigrant, for instance, right? So yes, again, good, important point. Anyone else for today? Good as always being with you. Hope all remains well there. Look forward to continuing the conversation. There may be a little debate coming up next week, and so maybe we'll have more to talk about in that regard as well. Be well.
Yeah.
See all of you next week. Take care. Bye bye.